I had my first particularly strange experience in the summer of '69. This was before I became a sheriff. I had been a cop in Goody for about a year or so. Now, Goody was a small town up in northwest Maine. No more than about 800 souls living there while I was stationed. I say was, because if you go up there today, about 10 or 12 miles east of Jackman, all you'll find is a bulldozed over plot. State bought the city for development of something or other, and then funding up and dried out. But that's a whole other story. So I was a young cop, or more of a deputy really, since there were all but 4 of us in the station back then. It was me, Christian Woods, Mackie, and Sheriff Young. I remember it perfectly. A little before folks were getting up for mass, when Sheriff Young knocked on my front door. I lived in a small one-room house, basically a refurbished log cabin on the outskirts of town from when the Pilgrims first came, and I can assure you, I was not yet up for church. When I answered the door, Sheriff Young was staring at me with his usual sour look and told me to get my pants and my gun. Before I could ask what was going on, he'd already turned heeled back to his pickup. I guess I should talk a bit about Sheriff Young. Despite the name, he was an old, mean, dried up son of a bitch. No one in town respected him more. His word was law, and he spoke it well. He'd been sheriff of Goody for about 30-odd years, and no one had seen more than him. And never once had I seen him break composure. That's why I knew something was wrong when I sat next to him in his truck, and halfway down the dirt road, he stuck a cigarette between his cracked lips and forgotten to light it. Eventually, we pulled onto Main Street and then off it again, and that's when I figured out where we were going. The Paulson house. The Paulson house was one of the newer houses in Goody. Built only 10 years ago on Cross and Hill by, you guessed it, the Paulson family. Some rich city types come out to Goody to get away from it all. I shouldn't say that, actually. There were good folks. When we pulled up the gravel driveway, Mackie and Christian Woods were already there, talking to a frantic Mr. and Mrs. Paulson. They were a mess. Mr. Paulson was halfway into his Sunday best, and his wife was still in her nightgown. Both were wide-eyed and frantic, like they'd seen a ghost. I didn't see where their daughter was. Cindy, her name was, I think. "Get in there and do something. My baby girl is sick." Mrs. Paulson was screaming at Mackie. Poor Mackie looked totally overwhelmed. "Get in there and do something about my daughter. She's not right. We need a doctor or a..." That was about when Sheriff Young interrupted and Mrs. Paulson went real quiet. He told Mr. and Mrs. Paulson to wait outside, then gestured for 3 of us to come follow him inside. We entered the house like it was a tomb. "What's going on, Sheriff?" I asked. "Is something wrong with Cindy?" Sheriff Young stopped halfway up the stairs and stared at me with his icy blue eyes. "Best you see yourself," he said flatly. We went down the upstairs hall and into Cindy's bedroom. It struck me as a typical rich 17-year-old girl's room. Posters of the Beatles, The Who, and so on and so forth. Fancy closets full of fancy clothes, and a double bed all for herself, frills and all. Would have been perfectly normal if it wasn't for the fact that Cindy Paulson was lying flat as a board 2 feet above her bed. Yeah, you heard right. I had to blink 3 times and kiss my cross before I could believe it. Cindy Paulson was floating above her bed, her arms flat against her sides and her eyes staring straight up at the ceiling. Mackie shoved past a lot of us, running straight towards Cindy Paulson as if we was gonna pull her down. Sheriff Young stopped him cold. "Nobody lay even a finger on her," he snarled. We cowered like dogs. Last person we'd heard Sheriff Young talk like that to ended up with a bullet in his head. Cindy Paulson, this is Sheriff Young. Can you hear me?" Cindy Paulson didn't say a word. She just kept floating. He asked again, "Cindy, If you can hear me, blink your eyes or move your fingers." I strained to get a look at her face. It sent a chill down my spine. Her face was like a picture of someone you'd scare jumping out of a closet. The moment between unaware and screaming. It was like any moment she'd open her mouth and holler at the top of her lungs. Her eyes were wide and afraid. We huddled in the doorway as Sheriff Young picked up the chair at her desk and prodded her with it, like he was taming a lion. Cindy didn't even move. She was totally frozen in place. That was, until Christian Woods spoke up. "Sir, she's going up." He was right. You couldn't tell from far away, but up close, Cindy Paulson was slowly but surely floating upwards towards the ceiling. I felt my stomach go ice cold. Sheriff Young barked his orders. We ran down to the trucks, grabbed all the straps we had on hand, and ran back upstairs, ignoring Mr. and Mrs. Paulson as they begged to know what was going on. By the time we got back, Cindy was now 3 feet above her head. We tossed 2 straps across her chests, one on her chest and one on her stomach, and we all took an end and started to pull. Little Cindy Paulson was built like a twig and no more than 5'6", but it was like trying to pull down a barn rafter. It was unthinkable. The 4 of us pulled and grunted and tried to force her back down to the bed. But the harder we pulled, the harder she seemed to resist. That's when I first heard it. It sounded like the whine of a beaten dog, low and piercing, but constant, like it was coming from a siren. "It's her," whispered Christian Woods, his eyes wide. Cindy's mouth, before closed in a silent scream, was open only slightly. That terrible whining sound was coming from inside her throat. She was starting to rise faster. "Pull harder, for fuck's sake!" screamed Sheriff Young. "Cindy, can you hear me? You're gonna be alright. We've got you." Sweat poured down my brow and my entire body was shaking as we pulled. It was impossible. Every second, Cindy was floating higher, and the whining in her throat was growing louder and shriller. Her face was contorting, but her body still paralyzed. She was screaming. Then Mr. and Mrs. Paulson came barging into the room, and they started screaming too. Mrs. Paulson fell to the ground, crying and wailing, and Mr. Paulson helped us pull, his face bright red. "My baby! No! God, please don't take my baby!" "Cindy Roberts Paulson, this isn't funny, young lady. You stop it. You stop it right now," hollered Mr. Paulson, tears and sweat streaming down his face. "Sheriff, she's gonna hit the ceiling," cried Christian Woods. The whole time, the screaming was getting louder and louder until we could barely hear ourselves think. Then suddenly, it went quiet, muffled. We looked up. Cindy Paulson didn't hit the ceiling. She was going through it. Mrs. Paulson screamed again, and I still hear it in my dreams. Pure horror and grief and agony. "Attic!" Sheriff Young ordered, but I was already on my way. As soon as I went up the stairs and opened the attic door, I nearly went deaf from Cindy's screaming. I can still see it. Jesus. Her face half sticking out of the floorboard, the wooden planks inside of her screaming mouth. She screamed, and her face was sheet white. In less than a minute, her whole body was inside the attic. Then she started melting through the roof. I rocketed down the stairs, and Mr. Paulson was already racing outside. Sheriff Young ordered me to follow. Mackie stood dumbfounded. The straps in his hands were cut clean through. By the time we got outside, Cindy Paulson was 10 feet above the house, still frozen and still screaming. She was climbing faster and faster, and Mr. Paulson was begging and weeping and cursing the entire time. He fell to the ground and clawed at his head in grief. The rest of us just stared, totally numb, as Cindy Paulson rose into the sky faster and faster until her screaming was gone and she disappeared into the clouds. Whole thing was over in 10 minutes. The weather that day was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, but not one of us wasn't shivering like a leaf. About an hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Paulson were finally able to talk in complete sentences, and we sat them down. Sheriff Young barely said a word, staring off into the woods with a cigarette in hand. But he was shaking. We all were. Meanwhile, Mackie tried to comfort the parents. And Christian Woods was talking of search and rescue and helicopters and the National Guard. What good that would do? I didn't know. How do you search for a 17-year-old girl who just flew into the sky? But we still told them we'd do everything we could to find their baby girl. That is until we heard the rain. First it was slow, steady, a pitter-patter on the roof. We ignored it at first. Then it came louder, faster, and we realized it wasn't raining on us at all, and the skies were mostly clear. I turned and looked up. In the exact spot Cindy Paulson had risen up into the sky, a shower of thick, dark blood was pouring from the clouds and splattering onto the roof. It fell for about 30 seconds, soaking the tiles and running down the gutters. Then it stopped, and all that was left behind was blood dripping from the roof and the screaming of the Paulsons. We never found out what happened to Cindy Paulson, nor did we ever see her again. Sheriff Young told us never to speak of what happened that summer morning at the Paulson house ever again. Not to anyone. I asked Sheriff Young if this had ever happened before. He didn't answer. I don't think it ever had. I didn't get much sleep that night, terrified that I'd wake up and be floating 2 feet above my bed in the morning. The next morning, when I talked to Mackie, he told me something that stuck with me. Maybe God called Cindy Paulson to heaven, but he didn't like what he saw. Now Mackie was a bit of a slow boy, but a good kid, so I didn't know what to think of that. Part of me hopes he was right, because within a month, both Mr. and Mrs. Paulson got called to heaven by God from the Paulson house, and he didn't like them either. The Paulson house has stood empty ever since. I never thought I had a scary story to tell until I drove through my old neighborhood. The memory hit me like a freight train, and even though I try not to think about it, it's stuck in my head replaying over and over again. I have to tell someone before I go crazy. I'm sure most people over the age of 20 know about the street lamp rule. As soon as the street lamps turn on, you come straight home. No ifs, ands, or buts. Even if you were playing a really fun game of kickball, or you still had one last person to find during your game of hide and seek. You always come home before it got too dark, even if you lived in the safest neighborhood in the world. Now we had those rules growing up in my neighborhood. I don't want to say the name of it for obvious reasons, but it was a small neighborhood in Southern California. It was a very quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other and there was never any trouble. But we always had to come home before the lights came on. Everything was fine during the day, but at night, all the parents got anxious. I never really noticed at first. I thought it was just parents upset that their kids weren't home yet. But as I got older, I realized that their reaction was odd. It would be normal if there was a crime. It would be normal if there was crime in our neighborhood, but save for the raccoons knocking over our garbage cans, there was never any trouble. I just shrugged it off as parents being parents, until I finally realized why we were supposed to come home. My friends and I had been playing all afternoon, and our games eventually moved from the quiet streets to the nearby woods. Even though it was getting late, my friends and I wanted to play one more game of hide and seek before we had to go home. We were around 10 at the time, so we were pretty young, but definitely not little kids. It was Mark, Sam, Tom, and I that day. Mark was the seeker, and the rest of us hid. Beep! Mark was the seeker, and the rest of us hid. I hid in the spot that I always used, and that had never failed me before. The old treehouse. I don't know why, but no one ever thought to check up there. It was probably because it was old and rickety, but I was never afraid to climb up there. Plus, I could see out the window and watch everyone else running around, and sometimes even see people hiding. About 20 minutes into our game, I saw Mark walk over to the street before turning back to the woods and yelling, "The lights are on! Game over! See you guys later!" Before he turned to run back home, which was just down the street. I sighed in disappointment before trudging down the ladder. As soon as my feet hit the forest floor, something felt wrong. There were no sounds, no crickets, no birds, nothing. The air felt weird, sort of like it does before a big thunderstorm. I shrugged it off and worked my way out of the woods. With it being so dark, it took me about 5 minutes to get out, and by the time I got out, I was covered in dirt and scratches from getting caught on branches and bushes. This was the latest I'd ever been out, and even though the rebel in me loved it, I was still anxious to get home, or else risk not getting dessert that night. I heard the brushes rustling and immediately turned around in fear, expecting to see some sort of horrible monster or animal waiting to pounce on me and take me away. But it was just Tom. I sighed, and he laughed at me and teased me about how scared I was. I rolled my eyes and called him some childish insult like boogerhead or jerk before starting my way back home. Our houses were about 10 minutes away, but on the way there, the later it got, the more it felt off. The air was thick. There were no bugs. It felt tense, like something was about to happen. Tom felt it too. We tried to talk about something, anything to get rid of this feeling. We talked about baseball, the teachers from school that everyone hated, even about homework, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. We nearly jumped out of our skin when the silence was broken by the sound of an old metal garbage bin hitting the asphalt of a nearby street and rolling across. We both turned to see the can lying in the middle of the street, illuminated by one of the streetlights. We stood there for what felt like hours before Tom laughed, elbowing me in the ribs playfully. "It's those old raccoons," he said, but I knew he didn't believe what he was saying. "Those things are always going through garbage. Mr. Smith's gonna be so upset when he finds out that his garbage is..." I turned to look at him in confusion as he stopped. He was staring straight ahead, eyes wide and mouth hanging open slightly. I tugged on his shirt and asked him what was wrong, and he lifted up his arm to point to the driveway where the trash can had rolled from, next to an old shed. I didn't see it at first, but after staring over at the shed, I saw it. I saw the reason we were supposed to come home as soon as the lights came on. At first, all I could see was this leg. My family was never big on hunting, but I could still recognize it as a deer leg, except much bigger and pure black. We both stood there in the middle of the street, staring at this leg that poked out from behind the shed. It quickly shot down to the ground, the hoof clacking on the pavement and making us both flinch. Suddenly, this awful sound filled the air. It started out soft, but it got louder and louder before going silent again. It was this terrible grating sound, like a hyena but more high-pitched and shrill. I jumped as I felt Tom grip my arm and move closer to me. I could feel him shaking, and I looked away from the leg to see what was wrong with him. This time, he was looking up at the roof of the shed, and I turned to look. I'm not ashamed to say that I felt the warm sensation of urine running down my leg after I noticed what he was looking at. It was black. I could barely see it, but the streetlight illuminated it just enough for me to see it. It was this skull peeking up over the roof of the shed, staring straight at us. It looked like the skull from a dog or a wolf. It had long fangs and sharp teeth, but instead of just being an empty skull, there were two glowing red orbs where the eyes would be. It was just resting on the roof, watching us with those awful red eyes. I soon noticed the black shiny fur that it was attached to as it slowly slid down the roof out of view, the bone clacking on the old shingles as it made its way down. The leg shuddered as we heard this crackling sound, like the sound your back makes if you twist it just right, or when you crack your knuckles. I saw its great neck extend up over the roof of the shed, getting taller and taller as it stood and emerged from its shadowy hiding place. It moved in the same way a deer would as it got up, slowly hefting itself off the ground before standing on all fours. Its neck was at least 10 feet long and was covered in fluffy black fur. Its body was sleek with shaggy fur on the back and a long tail hanging behind it. It shook its neck like a dog does when it's trying to get dry, before turning to look at us again. All we could do was stand there and stare at it as it loomed 20 feet away from us, just staring. We stood there for minutes, just staring at this thing that was standing in the middle of the street on the other side of the light. Suddenly, it let out this god-awful noise that I'll never forget. It opened its bony jaws and a long black tongue slithered out before it emitted this loud, ear-piercing howl. It sounded like a wolf howling mixed with the dying screams of a woman. This is when we turned and ran. We ran as fast as our little legs could carry us, down the street, screaming at the top of our lungs. We could hear it panting as it galloped down the street behind us, its ebony hooves clattering loudly on the pavement as it hauled ass after us. Even though our lungs were burning and we could barely see through the tears in our eyes, we kept running, not even caring if we woke the neighborhood with our noise. We had to have been at least 50 feet from my house, our safe place, when I heard it. I heard a shrill scream and the sound of something wet hitting the pavement. It was Tom. I kept running until I got to my house, ripping the door open as I ran inside, screaming. My mom immediately grabbed me as my dad rushed over, fear in his eyes. I was a mess in my mom's arms, crying and dry heaving as I tried to tell her what happened. She cradled me in her lap, stroking my hair as my dad rushed over to close the door, before collapsing on the floor next to us and hugging me like he'd never hugged me before. My dad is 80 years old, and to this day, that was the only time I've ever seen him cry. My mom carried me up the stairs and took me to the bathroom to assess me and make sure that I wasn't hurt, and looking over her shoulder, I saw my dad grab the rifle from over the fireplace mantel. He always told me that it was a decoration, and that's all it was there for. But now, I'm not so sure. My mom held me as I cried to sleep that night, my dad standing watch downstairs with his rifle. In the following weeks, no one went outside without their parents' supervision. No one played in the woods, or even in the river or field. Everyone stayed in the streets and yards of the small neighborhood, and people had their kids inside and doors locked by 6 p.m. every day. I never saw Tom again. Years later, I learned that the police had ruled it an animal attack. A dog or bear had got him and ripped him up. I never saw him, but according to the whispers I heard from my parents and neighbors, when they found him, he was practically skinned. His organs were missing. He was just an empty husk curled up in the street in a puddle of blood. My psychiatrist told me early on that it was a nightmare that my mind had created since I was so young and couldn't understand the trauma that I had gone through. I eventually started believing that and came to terms with what had happened. I believed it until yesterday. On the way to the hospital, I had to cut through my old neighborhood. My wife was giving birth to our first baby, a beautiful little boy weighing in at 7 pounds and 8 ounces. Despite my urgency, I still looked around my old neighborhood, recalling fond memories of me and my friends playing ball and running around in the sprinklers in the summer heat. I remembered Tom. I tried not to think about it, but as I drove by that street lamp that we had stood by that night, I couldn't help but remember my nightmares from my childhood. The road has since been redone to remove the dark blood stain that was left, but I could still see it in my mind's eye, along with the body of my dead friend, even though I had never really seen it. I have since moved my wife and our little boy, Tommy, 900 miles away from that godforsaken neighborhood, but I can still remember that night. I was emotional after I drove through that neighborhood, and my wife jokes that I cried more than our newborn, but it wasn't the memory that haunted me. It was seeing that shaggy black tail disappearing behind that shed when I drove past. So, I would consider camping my passion. It's the only hobby I have that I take so much interest in and get really excited to do. More specifically, camping alone. Of course, I camp with friends every once in a while, but nothing really matches the experience of camping in the wild, alone. Something about sitting by a fire you made yourself until late, and going to bed with nothing but the sounds of the wild to accompany you. Of course, camping alone also means I experience some pretty scary shit. Usually it's animals, howls and cries from the woods that send chills down your spine, or animals that take an interest in your tent. I've had bears sniff and bat at my tent, which is absolutely terrifying and usually keeps me up the rest of the night. I make sure I don't keep any food in my tent though, so no animals should ever really want to get into my tent. The scariest thing to encounter out in the wild, however, is another person. You would think that an animal and human footsteps sound relatively similar, but they don't. I've only had it happen twice until now. The first time it was just passing footsteps in the grass. They didn't do anything, but it still scared me shitless. The second time someone stopped and waited for a while. They sounded about 20 feet from my tent. I was holding my breath until they just walked off again. However, about a month ago, I had my scariest camping experience. It was probably about 2 a.m., and I had been lying in my sleeping bag for about an hour, just listening to the sounds of the wild, when I heard footsteps approaching me. I remember how they sounded as they brushed through the grass. They kept getting closer and closer, and at this point, I was pretty freaked. It sounded like they were directly approaching my tent. And that they were. They stopped right in front of the entrance of my tent. I was trying my hardest to keep my breathing quiet. I always take a handgun with me when I go camping, just to stay safe from animals. That was the first thing to come to my mind when they stopped in front of my tent. I needed that gun. As quietly as I could, I reached into my open backpack, feeling around softly through the clothing and such. I finally found the gun and pulled it out carefully. I held it tightly, staring at my tent door. What happened next really made me panic. The person outside my tent started to unzip my tent door. It was slow, like they were trying to be quiet. At this point, I was thinking, no more playing assumptions. You need to make sure you don't get murdered. So I flipped the safety off my gun. The person stopped unzipping my tent door after that click. I choked out the words, "Who's there? I have a gun." After that, the person ran off faster than I had ever heard someone running before. I couldn't shut my eyes after that. I was shaking. I thought for sure I was either going to be killed or kill someone that night. I still go camping alone. The scariness is honestly the best part. You never know what you're going to encounter out there.